Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this presentation about the Winter 2021 season expectations versus reality. Today we're going to be spending a little bit of time looking at three different data sources that help us understand what consumer perceptions were looking like last summer as it relates to this coming winter season, and then looking at some data that tells us how things have progressed since then and what we're seeing in terms of the reality of sales in retail so far. To start with some brief introductions, my name is Matt Herndon, and I'm a principal with Corona Insights. Corona is a market research, evaluation, and strategy consulting firm located in Denver, Colorado. In case anyone is wondering, our name has nothing to do with the coronavirus at all. We actually were started with the name Corona in 1999, and for us, the word Corona refers to the rays of the sun, so illuminating data is kind of the idea. I will also mention that David Kennedy, our principal and CEO, is very closely involved in the work that we do with SIA. You won't be hearing his voice on this presentation today, but he is active in the chat. And if you ever have any questions for us about any of the work that we've done, you might hear from David as well. So just to give you a quick overview of the topics that we're going to be covering today, first of all, we want to make sure that you understand what this data represents, and so we'll have a quick overview of the data sources that we used in this process. We'll start out by really talking about what we expected to see this season based on some consumer data that we saw last summer. And then we'll go into looking into how sales this season so far have compared to what we've seen in last year's season. And then we'll wrap up with some key takeaways just so everyone is clear kind of the big picture findings of this study. Just a few logistical notes before we dive in. First of all, some of this data has been presented previously. So if you are an SIA member and you recall seeing a webinar on a similar topic and with some similar data last summer, you're probably not crazy. You probably saw some of this previously, but we will be going beyond that data and looking at some more recent data to help paint the full picture today. I will also mention that this webinar is pre-recorded, so unfortunately we won't be answering questions live today. However, we are in the chat, so both David and I are in there. If you have any questions as we go along, feel free to ask, and we'll even stick around a little bit after the presentation itself to answer any lingering questions. Finally, I'll mention that you are more than welcome to follow up with questions after the presentation. We'll provide our website, and you are more than welcome to go on there. Just use the Contact Us button to send any questions our way, and we will be more than happy to answer those as we can. So before we dive in, we just want to make sure that everyone understands the actual data sources that are used for this, because there are three very different types of data that you'll be looking at and very different levels of interpretation that you can make based on that data. So the first data source that we're going to be looking at today is the Summer 2020 Enthusiast Survey. And as I alluded to earlier, this is a survey that we've presented the results on previously, and so some of this may look a little bit familiar for some of you. This was an online survey that we conducted last summer, and the people who responded to this survey were largely drawn from attendees at consumer snow shows and other contacts of SIA. Now, in terms of who they tend to be highly active participants, and we'll refer to them throughout our discussion today as enthusiasts. And the big thing to note here is just that this is not a random survey of all snow sports participants. It really is people who are enthusiastic about the sport, and so just make sure that you understand that this isn't necessarily a view of the casual participant necessarily. In terms of when these were conducted, there were two waves. We'll just call them July and August. And these tended to be very long, in-depth surveys. And so these are a full survey questionnaire. We're able to dive very deeply into the findings. And in the other report that we did last summer, we actually dove into some of the individual segments to understand how some of these things that we'll look at today differ between various types of participants. And the final thing I'll mention is that these are based on pretty large sample size. And so when you look at the percentages in this, based on this data, they will be pretty reliable data. They're going to be pretty precise. The next data source that we will look at today is what we'll call the Industry Pulse surveys. So these are also online surveys, but the purpose and the way that they're distributed is a little bit different. So the gist of this is that in an effort to help promote communication and connect dots across the industry, each month SIA gathers insights from four groups: retailers, resorts, suppliers, and consumers. And the overall goal is just to help paint a picture of what these different segments of the industry are seeing or feeling across the country as we move through the season. So this is a little bit different than the surveys that we talked about before. First of all, as I mentioned, this is data that is collected monthly, and the data that we have today is from September through December 2020. It's a very short survey. In fact, the only two questions that we'll be looking at today are essentially what's going well, or what are you excited about for the season, and what are your concerns about the season. And these have relatively small sample sizes. So these are not robust surveys necessarily. They're not meant to be, anywhere from 15 to 100 or so responses per month, depending on the segment and the month. And so we'll be interpreting this data more qualitatively. We're not going to be spending a lot of time on exactly what the percentages are, but they do help us to give, as the name describes, the pulse of the industry and kind of what people are thinking across these four segments. The final type of data that we'll be looking at today is from the NPD Industry Market Report. And I would imagine that many of you are familiar with this data, but just in case, we'll make sure everybody's clear. So this is not survey data. This is actually point of sale data that is collected at cash registers across different types of retailers. And the three main segments that we have access to are snow specialty stores, snow specialty e-commerce stores, and chain stores. And so this really just helps us to understand what's actually selling at retail. And the data that we have today is the winter 2020-2021 season through November. So that's August, September, October, November. Unfortunately, this data lags just a little bit, so we don't have December's data just yet, but it helps us to understand how things were looking in the beginning of the season. The last thing that I will say before we dive into the data is that we want to set the stage with a really good quote that we heard from one of our survey respondents last summer. And I'll just read it to you here. "The season will be an opportunity for the snow sports industry to innovate and reassure consumers that winter activities can be enjoyed safely, both from a physical and economic perspective. The dichotomy the snow sports industry must collectively overcome is that, while on and off-hill recreation activities are generally safe by nature, the social nature of off-hill activities present challenges to effectively control virus spread." And here's the key point here. "As participants, we can only hope that early season results of virus mitigation planning and consumers' adherence to safety protocols established by resorts on and off-hill prove effective to restore consumer confidence and economic vitality for the industry we love." So overall, I think the point is simple here. This participant was just hopeful for the season and hoping that everything would go well so that we could all get back out and do the sport that we love. Okay, so at this point, let's dive into the data. So as a reminder, data in this section comes from the Summer 2020 Enthusiast survey conducted in July and August. And just a reminder, this is a large sample size, robust survey, so the numbers are fairly precise. However, again, remember that these data represent enthusiasts and may not necessarily reflect the opinions of more casual participants. The first big finding from this survey is that enthusiasts were more likely to be excited than not excited for the winter season. Getting into exactly what we mean by that, the first question we'll look at here, and if you're trying to orient yourself, there will always be the question text at the very bottom of these slides. So the question here was, compared to a normal year before COVID-19, how excited are you to participate in snow sports this season? And so what we see here is that the blue represents people who said they were more excited this season than usual. The orange represent people who said they were less excited than usual, and the gray who are the people who said that they were about the same. So overall, you can see that despite the challenges, enthusiasts were generally more excited for snow sports than usual. So we see more of the blue bars than the orange bars. And though the differences are slight, we did see more excitement in August than we did in July. So for the most part, we saw a slight increase in excitement heading into the season. We also asked a follow-up question to this, which was open-ended, so people could write in whatever response that they wanted to. So the question was fairly simple, just why? So why are you more or less excited to participate in snow sports this season? And overall, what we saw is that there was significant optimism about snow sport this season, but not surprisingly, COVID was a concern. Diving into that a little bit more deeply, one of the first big things that we saw was that many respondents noted they were excited to engage in snow sports this year just since last season was cut short. So as I'm sure we all recall, most areas were shut down last March, and so because of that, many people felt like they kind of missed out on the end of their season last year and were just excited to get back out there. We also heard a lot of people say that they really felt like snow sports are a relatively safe activity. So compared to many other things that you could do to get active, being outside and in nature was really believed to be pretty safe. We also have some direct quotes from the people who answered this question that I'll be reading kind of as we go throughout our presentation today. The first of those is that I am very anxious to get on my skis again since the 2020 season was cut short. I believe any outdoor recreation activity is beneficial to the mind, body, and soul. I'm spending a lot more time outside than I ever have before. And I'm sure those of us who have relations in the summer sports activity can attest that last year was really big for a lot of outdoor activities. And this person is basically saying getting outside is great, and they're hoping to do so in the winter as well. We did, on the other hand, see some who were still fearful that COVID-19 may make on-resort snow sports risky, especially during weekends or holidays. So, in particular, people were somewhat concerned about indoor spaces, and because of that, many said that they would bring food, avoiding rentals, gear up in the car, those kinds of things. And some also worried about access being restricted at ski areas. So, a couple quotes related to that. First of all, hopefully ski areas will be able to open and implement COVID-19 safety precautions like not filling chairs with people not in a group and requiring face coverings, social distancing in lines and common areas. Another person said, I expect less opportunities with capacity limited resorts. I also worry about people taking the virus seriously if I'm able to participate. The next big finding from the survey was that many expected reductions in spending, but not so much for outdoor purchases compared to other types of purchases. This next question is a little bit more complex, so I'll spend a moment to make sure you understand what it is that you're looking at here. So the question that we asked was, how do you anticipate the COVID-19 situation will affect your family's spending in the next year compared to normal in each of the following categories? And what you're seeing here in the bars is that we took the percentage of people who said that they expected their spending rather to increase, and we subtracted the percentage of people who felt that their spending would decrease in each of those areas. And so the big things that stand out here, first of all, the areas that were expected to decrease the most were all revolving around travel and hospitality. So things like restaurants, hotel and resort stays, domestic flights, international flights. All of those categories, our respondents were really expecting those to decline this year compared to previous years. Kind of related to that, things like private home rentals, cruises, adventures, and tours, those were not quite as significantly reduced this year compared to in the past, but they still were quite low compared to past years. So on the good side, for those of us in the outdoor industry, when we asked people how much they expected to spend on outdoor or recreation gear and products, it was almost a no change depending on how you look at it. So in July, overall, we had a net decrease of 9%. In August, that had changed into a net positive of 2%. So overall, my interpretation of that is that outdoor spending was expected to be relatively stable, perhaps down a little bit compared to previous years, but nowhere near as down as some other industries, in particular travel. The third big takeaway from this survey is that there was significant interest in off-resort snow sports. Similar to the previous slide, we also wanted to look at, in addition to how we expected spending to change, we wanted to know how we expected participation to change. And so we asked the question, how do you anticipate your participation in the following activities in the next year will compare to your participation before COVID-19? So one thing to note is that this is only among people who had participated in each sport. So it's really a measure of the people who are into each of these different activities, do they expect to do more or less? So it's not terribly surprising to see that all of these are positive. So overall, people were hoping to do more outdoor things based on, kind of the situation this year. But it is helpful to dive in a little bit into the various pieces of this and what we see. First of all, again, those of you who have any interaction with summer activities would be able to tell us that bicycling was through the roof this year. We had lots and lots of people getting out there and participating more frequently. And so we saw that reflected in our data as well, that among bicycling participants, the net change in participation was a positive 59%. We also saw other summer sports like hiking and backpacking, paddle sports, camping, those kinds of things being very positive. So snow sports was also thought to be in the positive direction, but not quite as high as some of those other ones that we just looked at. And so overall, the takeaway here is similar to what we talked about before. We see a lot of enthusiasm for people to get out and participate in snow sports this season. Perhaps not quite the big spike that we saw with some of the summer activities that you looked at above, but nonetheless, people are hoping to get out and be active. We also wanted to dive even one step deeper on this. So, among the people who had participated in some sort of snow sports, which is just about everyone given the source of this list, we wanted to know what types of activities they expected to increase or technically decrease, although we didn't see a lot of that, their participation in this year. And what we really saw as the big takeaway here is that off-resort snow sports were really poised for significant growth this year. So we saw lots of interest in increasing participation in cross-country skiing, backcountry AT skiing, snowshoeing, uphilling, and fat bicycling. So really all the things that allow you to participate in your activities without necessarily having to get on a lift. When it comes to the actual on-resort activities like skiing, telemarking, snowboarding on resort, we did see people overall expecting to increase their activity this year, but it's just not as significant as the interest in increasing participation in non-resort activities. So our next question we ask, in a scenario where ski resorts are unable to operate at full capacity this winter season, how would you adjust your participation in outdoor activities? And what we saw is that when asked how they would change their participation, non-snow sport activities would be a popular choice for many. However, respondents did say that they would increase their participation in a wide variety of other activities as well. So things like snowshoeing and cross-country skiing tended to be really popular. Again, kind of related to what we saw before, off-resort activities being the most popular. We also saw interest in things like winter running and hiking, sledding, uphilling, and backcountry skiing as well. The fourth of the big findings that we had from this survey was that in-person spending was expected to lag compared to the past. So the next question is, have you done any of the following since the beginning of the COVID-19 situation? That's what you see on the left. And on the right, we have, after the COVID-19 situation has subsided, how frequently do you think you will use these types of purchase options? And what we see here is that around 3/4 of our respondents said that they had bought an item online due to COVID-19 that they had previously only purchased in person. And around 1/3, 31%, said that they would at least frequently do so after the COVID-19 situation has subsided. So this doesn't necessarily suggest a full shift toward online shopping, but it's clear that the pandemic has resulted in many people becoming more comfortable with online shopping. And in all likelihood, this will have a long-term impact beyond brick and mortar retailers. Many also said that they had used curbside pickup or delivery from local stores, and some had shifted their spending towards discount brands. But overall, we don't see the same level of long-term impact with these that we saw with the broader shift toward online shopping. Our next question was, given the COVID-19 situation, how do you anticipate your spending on snow sports related products this season will compare to your normal spending at each of the following types of retailers? And what we see is that compared to normal, slightly more respondents expected to increase their spending at online big box stores like Amazon compared to those who expected to decrease their spending at those kinds of stores. So on the whole, respondents expected to decrease their spending at basically all other types of retailers. I will mention though that these decreases were lowest for specialty stores, both in person and online, as well as brand direct types of websites. The biggest losers, if you can call it that, was based on the responses from our enthusiasts, were that decreases in spending would be pretty significant for outdoor chains like REI and Dick's and general department stores like Walmart and Target. We also wanted to get a feel for how the long-term shift toward online shopping will look. So to what extent will things come back to normal when everything has subsided, or to what extent is the shift to online shopping somewhat permanent? So what we can see here is that before the COVID-19 situation, over half of our respondents said that they were more likely to purchase snow sports gear and apparel in person. During the situation, the percentage dropped dramatically to only 12% in July. We also asked what they felt like they would do after the situation, and we did see some respondents expecting to shift their purchases back to in-person shopping, up to 26% in July. So overall, while this does suggest that brick and mortar retail will rebound somewhat after the pandemic has subsided, it is a little bit unlikely that it will ever fully return to pre-COVID levels. And it also appears that interest in in-person shopping dropped somewhat even in recent months. You can see that in August, those percentages dropped even a little bit further. Our next big finding, and the last one in this section, is that our core participants really were still pretty excited about the upcoming season. A similar question to the one that we looked at in the very beginning about excitement, we also asked the question, what is your overall confidence level in getting to participate in your preferred snow sports activities this season as much as you'd like to? And so overall, you see more people are optimistic than pessimistic about their chances to participate this year. So 32% in August said that they were optimistic compared to only 22% of people in August who said they were pessimistic. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. Lots of people who are somewhere in the middle, but overall people were pretty excited still and pretty optimistic that they would be able to get out this season. Okay, that's all of the time that we'll spend with our summer 2020 enthusiast survey data. So now we want to shift gears a little bit to the ongoing industry pulse surveys conducted by SIA. So as a reminder, the data in this section comes from those industry pulse surveys. They're conducted each month. Again, this isn't necessarily a representative sample, and the sample sizes here are pretty small. But all of this data is based on open-ended questions that were categorized, and so overall we'll really focus on the major trends rather than digging into the exact numbers. We'll start out by looking at the industry pulse surveys from our enthusiasts. And the big thing that we saw here was that enthusiasts remain excited for snow sports this year, but there are still concerns about safety and closures. We're going to be looking at a lot of charts that look very similar here, and so I want to spend a little bit more time on this first one, just making sure everyone is clear about what this data represents. First of all, these are all open-ended questions in this section. So as I mentioned earlier, they basically are just what are you looking forward to or what's going well, and then what are you concerned about or what's not going well. And each one of these was an open-ended question. Our team went through and coded these responses based on the major things that we were hearing. And you'll see the results of these, and they all look at individual months, September, October, November, December. So the lightest bar being September, the darkest bar being December. And that will hold for this entire section. So getting into this particular slide, when we ask our enthusiasts what they were looking forward to with the upcoming season, mainly people were just excited about the overall snow sports season. Just generally getting back out on the snow, having fun, all those kinds of things. One specific quote that we heard on that one was that people were looking forward to getting back on the snow and bringing some normalcy to my life, even if it'll be different due to COVID. We actually heard some people who said that they were really looking forward to safety protocols, not necessarily the protocols themselves, but just a feeling of being safe while doing an activity that they love. And one quote related to that was just safe ways of being outside. And then finally, this one was kind of interesting. We saw some people say that they were looking forward to having fewer crowds. So the idea here being that some people would stay away from resorts because they were worried about the pandemic. And so that would actually make for a better experience for everybody else who went. And so, as I mentioned there, somebody said, hopefully lots of snow and uncrowded ski slopes. Next, we ask, what are your concerns about the coming season? And you can see that there is some variance here, but really all of these were fairly similar in terms of how many people mentioned each of them. So the most common answer that we saw overall, at least on average, was just general concerns about COVID. We also saw some who were concerned about specifically resort restrictions or closures related to the pandemic. And you can also see that, again, we try not to focus too much on the absolute percentages here because of the small sample sizes, but we heard a lot more about concerns about resort restrictions and closures in December than we had in previous months. So I suspect that some were starting to see the actual impacts of that in their own activities. One quote related to that is that somebody was concerned about COVID restrictions, getting lift tickets since I do not have a season pass, and going into the lodge. Those are things that they were concerned about. Other than that, we also saw some people who were concerned about the actual safety and protocols. We had some who were concerned about distancing and crowds. And so it's almost the opposite of what we heard a few people say previously, that we had some people who said that they were excited to not have as many people on the mountain, but it's hard to have distancing when there's a lot of crowds in the base areas and in lines and things like that. So somebody said the mountains will be overwhelmed with people who just want to get out of their homes and have no knowledge of how to be safe. A few other things, we had some concerns about reservations and limited capacity, some concerned about snow conditions, and some just feeling like they wouldn't be able to participate as much as they would like to due to travel restrictions. So somebody said that travel safety and not knowing when it will be safe to travel again. Next, we'll look at how our resort leaders responded to these same types of questions. And overall, what we saw is that our resorts reported high enthusiasm, but restrictions, closures, and general uncertainty are presenting challenges for them. So this question is slightly different than what we saw for enthusiasts, but it's basically the same gist, and that is that please share your thoughts on anything that's going particularly well this season or in anticipation of this season for those who were responding a little bit earlier. So again, I'll stress, don't worry too much about the absolute percentages here. They do tend to jump around quite a lot due to the small sample sizes, but overall, you can see that many people reported that the enthusiasm for the season or demand was actually pretty positive this year. We also saw many who said that the safety and protocols seemed to be going reasonably well, and others who had said that passes and sales seemed to be going fairly well, in addition to just the general enthusiasm and demand. So a couple quotes related to these. Somebody said that season pass sales have been strong, and there's a general sense that there are a lot of people looking for things to do outdoors this winter. Related to safety protocols, somebody said, generally speaking, most guests are happy to comply with COVID policies, and our limited numbers with a reservation system helps control traffic and gives us an opportunity to communicate with guests prior to their visit about COVID policies. On the other hand, not too surprisingly, we do have some concerns from our resorts as well, and in particular, challenges remain in handling reduced capacity and the uncertainty of restrictions and closures. So first of all, the most common response overall was concerns about safety and protocols. Relatedly, we also had concerns about capacity and distancing. Some had concerns about restrictions and closures, and some were concerned about low participation overall, especially with regard to travel restrictions. A couple quotes related to these. Somebody said that crowding and capacity is definitely a concern. Managing expectations and being able to provide space for changing and other pre and post activities might take some creative thinking. So just trying to figure out how things were going to get done this year due to all of the safety protocols. Someone was concerned about guests not following state regulations and resort guidelines and putting their own employees at risk. So they were concerned about having the resort having to shut down just due to breakouts and infections and actually having to eliminate jobs as a result. Finally, one other said that with more states restricting travel and stricter protocols that will affect our ski area business, and in addition to capacity restrictions, we will lose out on sales to online because people will come more prepared. So just that even if people are actually coming to the resorts, the actual retail might suffer because people are already ready to go because they are trying to avoid indoor spaces at the resorts. Next, we'll look at a little bit of the perceptions that we heard from suppliers. And overall, what we heard was that suppliers are reporting strong sales, but there are challenges in just doing business, and those tend to be pretty common. Overall, the main thing that we heard from our suppliers were that they increasingly reported demand as being strong. And so you can see on the top set of bars that overall from September, October, and December, we saw a general upward trajectory in the percentage of our suppliers who mentioned sales and demand being strong. We did see a dip downward in November. I think I would just remind everybody that this is based on very small sample sizes, and so I don't think that that's necessarily meaningful. And regardless, I think that the overall story here is that it seems like sales and demand were going fairly well for most suppliers. The other categories that we heard from suppliers in terms of going well, many were mentioning that operations were going well, especially some I think early on were very concerned about supply chains and things like that. And there are some issues there, but overall, it seems like we have some who feel like operations are going well. And then just general enthusiasm, both from backcountry specifically and general snow sports, that it seems like they're hearing a lot of enthusiasm from people for the year. So a few quotes related to all these. We have one person who mentioned dealers who canceled orders. Some are coming back to us already to order products due to consumer demand. So again, kind of the things that are going well. The outdoor retailers that have opened or are opened appear to be doing well considering all that's happening in the retail market. Online sales really seem to be taking off, and Nordic sales are off the charts. So a lot of the things that we've been seeing evidence of throughout our presentation today, but just further evidence from the suppliers in terms of what they're seeing on their end. On the negative side, the biggest thing that our suppliers were concerned about were simply closures, both resorts having to close and thereby reducing demand, and then individual retailers having to close, presumably due to outbreaks and things like that. So in all 3 months, that was the most common, or at least one of the most common concerns that our suppliers mentioned. Some also mentioned low sales or sales challenges, and we'll get to that here in just a second. Some mentioned just general low participation or low travel as being a concern, and then uncertainty or cancellations, just not knowing what to expect, or some mentioning concerns about operations. And in particular, that spike that you see in December, many of those were mentioning issues with inventory and just not being able to keep things moving through as quickly as they'd like to. A couple quotes related to this. First, a resurgence of the virus that moves us back to closing businesses. I'm also hoping retailers are looking at what they really need and adjusting orders accordingly. It doesn't help any of us to ship product where it isn't needed or puts a financial strain on our dealers. We also heard the ability to do line showings in person and the number of opportunities we have to show products is drastically reduced. So that would be an example of one that would end up in that category of sales challenges. So just not being able to do business in the way that they historically have due to the significant reductions in opportunities to meet people in person. Finally, the last group that we will look at here are our retailers. And overall, what we see here is that our retailers are beginning to see strong sales, but many are still concerned about closures. So on the positive side, the big thing that we're seeing here is that retailers increasingly report demand being stronger than expected. And you can see that represented with the first bar at the top there, or sets of bars at the top there, about sales and demand. And you can see, again, I'll stress that these are small sample sizes, so that don't rely on the absolute percentages, but you can see that the number of people or the percentage of people who are mentioning sales or demand being high has increased pretty dramatically in December compared to the previous months. So that seems to be going well. Although the number of people who mentioned it has been declining a little bit, the next most common category was people who just felt like enthusiasm for general snow sports was high. Similarly, we had some who mentioned specifically that backcountry enthusiasm was quite high. And then the fourth category, we had a number of people who said that they feel like the safety protocols seem to be going well with regard to protocols in retail stores specifically. So a few quotes related to this one. In our area, the stoke is as high as ever this year, despite concerns over the ski area. Seasonal rentals and shop services seem to have taken off with a fury in September, and October seems to be going well so far also. Someone mentioned that the website business has picked up, unfortunately not enough to compensate for lost in-store sales, but they're hoping that winter will make people want to be outside and need warm clothes. And finally, sales of uphill capable gear are very strong. The committed skier is exhibiting a sense of urgency in anticipation of shortages. So for our retailers on the negative side, overall, the things that we heard were that concerns about closures are still there and inventory is becoming a concern in some cases. So the most common categories that were mentioned by people here, although it's jumped around a lot, overall we heard more people across all 4 months saying that they were concerned about safety and protocols. Others, although it was reduced in recent months, were concerned about resort restrictions or closures. And then the third most common category, just the inventory concerns, were becoming more common. And you can see that there's a slight jump in December up to 26% of people who mentioned that in their response. A few specific quotes here. I'm concerned that the state could shut down due to COVID cases this winter. There's also a possible decline in tourists and out-of-state customers. Some ask, how do we change a business model of high volume and lots of customer contact to the opposite and maintain any profitability? How do we do boot fitting without contact? How do we allow customers to try on anything? And finally, just the ability to maintain inventory on fast-selling product has been an issue. All right, we're starting to near the end of the data we have to present today. And so data in this final section, as a reminder, comes from NPD's point of sale reports. And so this is looking at how sales have performed this season so far, and in particular from August through November. Again, December data not quite available yet, but hopefully that will be available very soon. So the first kind of view of this data that we want to look at are differences by what NPD refers to as super categories. So the super categories are accessories, apparel, and equipment. And we'll be looking at things in later slides based on very more detailed versions of all of these categories. And we'll also be looking at things in terms of how they compare across different channels as well. So we'll have a few different ways of looking at how things are going. But first of all, when it comes to units, overall units this year so far are down about 10% or so. Accessories are down about 7%, apparel is down about 7%, and equipment's down about 22%. It's interesting, though, that if we look at things by dollars instead of units, things are a little bit better. Overall, dollars are down about 7%. Accessories are actually up in dollars about 2%. Apparel's down about 9%, and equipment is down about 2%. So in terms of just trying to figure out what in the world is going on here and what explains how different those two are, it really is that the average price for most of our categories anyway is up this year compared to the past, and in some cases very significantly. So for example, the average accessory price is up about 10% this year. So while the units are down 7%, the overall dollars are up 2%. And when it comes to equipment, it was down 22% in units, but it's actually up 26% in average price. And so I think what you're seeing here is that people are buying higher end equipment. And this is where we have to read between the lines a little bit, so don't take this too far. But I think what you're seeing here is that we have retained our enthusiasts pretty well this year, and it may be the more casual participant who we may be missing. And so because of that, we're seeing the high end equipment selling well, but the mid tier equipment maybe not selling as well as it has been in the past. Next, let's take a look at how things have differed this year compared to last year in terms of the various channels. And so on this slide, we'll be looking at everything in terms of units just to keep things apples to apples and help us to be able to compare. So overall, starting with specialty, you can see that unit sales are down 23% overall this year. And that's really fairly consistent across all of the super categories. So down 23% for accessories, 21% for apparel, and 25% for equipment. When it comes to chains, we see that overall the total sales are down about 11%. Accessories are down about 2%. So really accessories there is performing about as normal in chains. Apparel is down by about 8%, but the big loser when it comes to chains is that equipment sales have actually dropped fairly significantly, down about 35% this year compared to past years. So we're seeing all this negativity, but you might recall previously that we didn't see that much of a drop overall. So what's happened there? Well, it's internet sales. You can see that overall total internet sale units are up about 18% this year compared to the previous season. Accessories are down just a little bit. Apparel is up, but the big mover that really accounts for a lot of the differences that we're seeing so far is that internet sales of equipment are up 59% in units this year. So clearly, if we kind of look across all of this, you can see that what has happened here is that specialty stores, especially brick and mortar stores in particular, have lost out a bit, whereas internet specialty stores have really had a great year overall. So now let's spend a little bit of time diving into each of the super categories and looking at some of the subcategories underneath those. Starting with accessories, this one is actually fairly consistent across the slightly more detailed categories. So like we saw in the beginning, overall units for accessories were down about 7%. But for bags and sunglasses, it's really about the same level of drop, around minus 10% for bags, minus 7% for sunglasses. Overall, dollar sales are pretty flat when it comes to accessories, but like we saw earlier, the average price is up a little bit. Again, reading between the lines a little bit, the chances are what's going on here is that we have slightly higher more enthusiastic participants who are buying slightly higher end equipment, and that's driving a slight increase in the average price. When it comes to apparel, overall units, as we saw before, down about 7%, dollars down about 9%, and the average price really hasn't changed a lot here. The big areas that have dropped this year compared to last season tend to be just your garments, so cold weather undergarments, outerwear, socks, and hosiery. So my guess here is that we're seeing people who are sticking with the apparel that they've had from past years and aren't as interested in going out and buying new apparel. Finally, looking at the equipment super category, obviously there's a lot on this slide, and so we'll just really focus on the highlights. So as we saw in the beginning, overall units were down about 22% for equipment, dollars down about 2%, and the average price up about 26%. So again, we see a lot more of what we'll call the enthusiast buying. Higher end equipment is likely driving that increase in average price. But perhaps the big story here, and we've seen kind of some foreshadowing of this from both our enthusiast survey from the summer, as well as some of the things that we were hearing from our partners in retail and at the resorts, is that, man, Alpine touring equipment and Nordic equipment are really through the roof this year. Unit sales up 76% and 111% for those two categories. Dollar sales up 91% and 111%. I'm sorry, 117% this year. And overall average price up slightly, but not a huge amount. So certainly if you are a retailer and you have the opportunity to get access to more inventory of backcountry equipment, it's going to be a big category this year. You probably already know that, but that seems to be the real push for where sales are this year. I will also mention, just to keep emphasizing the point that we've talked about a couple times here, is that the average price for equipment is up almost across the board. The only category being slightly down is telemark equipment. But everything else, we see our consumers are purchasing higher end equipment than they have in the past. And so I think, again, this probably suggests that the more casual participant isn't out there as much as they have been in the past. And so the things that are selling tend to be the higher end types of equipment. Okay, we have reached the end of the formal presentation in terms of the various data sets that we will be looking at today. So we want to wrap things up by just talking about some of the key takeaways. Everything that you'll hear here we've already talked about, but just to kind of reiterate some of the big things that we saw in this data. First of all, our enthusiasts remain excited for the season, but there are some concerns among, in particular, more casual participants. Again, that's reading between the lines a little bit. We don't actually have survey responses from our casual participants, but it definitely seems like our enthusiasts are out there. They're as active as they want to be. They're buying. They're still participating, but the sales seem to be drifting toward the higher end equipment, and so it seems like casual participants may be the types of people who we're missing out on a little bit this year compared to previous years. Overall, our resorts are adapting to the new normal. So there are certainly concerns about closures. There are certainly some challenges that are happening in our resorts, but overall, resorts have implemented the protocols as required. And for the most part, the feedback that we're getting from the resorts is that those protocols are working relatively well. And so despite the challenges, our resorts are making the best of the situation this year and doing the best they can. Overall, our sales are down somewhat, but off-resort categories are really thriving. So obviously, we just looked at that, and we are seeing sales down somewhat, in particular in brick and mortar stores, not necessarily online where sales are up, but regardless of the category, off-resort categories are thriving. And again, if you have the ability to stock up on inventory for those off-resort categories like backcountry products, be sure to do so because there seems to be a lot of interest in that this year. In-person spending will likely continue to lag compared to the past. So we've seen that so far this year, sales at brick and mortar are down quite a bit compared to previous years. We also saw that consumers expect to be buying online more now and into the future than they have in the past. And so unfortunately, brick and mortar stores are likely going to see some challenges just based on everyone getting used to buying online and especially this year not being a little bit more comfortable with buying online in many cases compared to going into a brick and mortar store. Finally, there is hope that early 2021 will show positive signs, and so we see a lot of enthusiasm being reported by our resorts and our retailers and even those entities talking to their suppliers. So we see that things are going, I would call them reasonably well. I'm not saying that it's going to be a banner year for Snowsports, but there are signs that things are going better than expected in a lot of cases, in particular when it comes to backcountry, and that hopefully early 2021 will continue to show some positive trends. So finally, before we wrap up here, I just want to close with another quote that we heard from a survey respondent that really wraps up everything that we're all about in the industry. And this person said, "I just want to say thanks to everyone who hangs in and provides skiing in spite of the constant challenges. Warmer winters, extreme cost of infrastructure, insurance, etc. I'm afraid I think snowsports might be doomed as our world changes, but for as long as I can, I'll keep skiing every year. It's been very important to me personally and is the most important unifying theme for my family." Okay, that is officially the end of our formal presentation today. So thank you all for joining us very much, and I hope this has been informative in helping you to understand what we were expecting the season to look like based on how consumers were feeling at the beginning of the season and into the summer. what we're seeing so far from a lot of our leaders and what we're seeing in retail sales and how this season has compared to the past. I think overall there's optimism that we'll all get through this and that it'll end up being a better than expected year, despite the fact that there are definitely some challenges, and we certainly understand that. As I mentioned in the beginning, we are live and in the chat, and so if you have any remaining questions, we will be more than happy to answer those. So we do still have a little bit of time in our slot here to address some of those questions, and so feel free to ask there, or if you'd like, just kind of stick around and see what questions others have. If anything comes up after today that you'd like to get some clarification on, or even if you just have some questions that you'd like to run by us, we are more than happy to assist in any way that we can. Feel free to contact us. Probably the easiest way is to go to coronainsights.com and click the Contact Us link, and that will allow you to submit a message that will go directly to David, and we will respond to those as soon as we can. So again, thank you for your time today, and we will look forward to speaking with everyone soon.